Topic Notes 3.6 Nutrient Cycles. This is a picture from Everglades National Park. Now, when most people think about the Everglades, they think of sprawling sawgrass marshes and swamps. But there's a ton of coastline along Florida Bay that's all filled with mangroves. And the key thing here is plants need nutrients, and thus animals need the nutrients. How do they get there? How do they cycle? That is what this is all about. So let's get started. Of course, let's start off with our main ideas. Nutrients are minerals that are required by organisms for energy supply and for growth and maintenance of body tissues. The availability of nutrients has a large effect on productivity and therefore on the types of numbers of organisms that live in different parts of the ocean at different times. Now, there are a lot of specific learning goals targeted here in this note set, so make sure you're reviewing them before you get too far into this note set, and of course afterwards as well. It's probably important to start off with the definition of nutrient. A nutrient is a chemical that provides what is needed for organisms to grow, repair damaged cells or tissue, and release energy for their metabolism. They can come in organic form, like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, or in inorganic salts like magnesium and calcium. Now, we've talked about nutrients probably your whole life when you think about what you eat and the foods that you eat. Same thing. We're looking at those specific components of those foods, though. Now, of course, nutrients have cycles. Nutrient cycles are the movement and exchange of elements that are essential to life from inorganic molecules through fixation and then into living organisms before being decomposed back into inorganic molecules again. Now, nutrients and matter in general are finite and vary throughout ecosystems based on biological and geological processes. Here is a diagram of the water cycle, and the reason why I give you this is because the water cycle is an example of a cycle you've learned about since you were a little kid, and it helps move a lot of other nutrients through the system, and we'll get into that as we go as well. Now, these nutrients are being moved through the cycle, and then they are assimilated. Assimilation is the conversion of a nutrient into a usable form that can be incorporated into tissues of an organism, from abiotic to the biotic part of these cycles. Now, an example here is carbon dioxide, which is fixed during photosynthesis. Remember, it's out there as gas, and plants take it in and fix it through the process of photosynthesis and produce glucose, which includes the carbon atoms. This can be converted into other molecules by producers, such as starch, and we're going to get into that in a bit too. Once fixed into the biotic cycle, nutrients can transfer from one trophic level to the next. And here's a diagram of a plant, and this is a terrestrial plant, I know, because it's just an easy way to kind of think of things, but marine plants function the same way. Carbon dioxide and CO2 being taken up, and of course being incorporated into the tissues. So what are these nutrients we're talking about? Well, here's a table that tells you about quite a few of them. Nitrogen, for example, is used to make proteins and DNA, as you see pictured there on the bottom left. Carbon is used to make all organic compounds because we are carbon-based life forms, as we know. Magnesium is used to make chlorophyll. It's actually a key component of that. You can see that in that second to the left image, and that's really important to keep in mind. Calcium is used to make bones, shell, and coral skeletons, so that's extremely important in the marine environment especially. And phosphorus is also another component that's in DNA and bones. So all of these are incredibly important, and they're not the only ones. There are more. Now, as we get into this, you're going to note that nutrient cycles have biotic and abiotic phases. So parts of their cycle in which they're tied up in organic living things, and part of their cycle where they are not. And essentially, that's what we're going to look at. You've got primary producers, which are generally the entry into the living system that most nutrients have, and then that gets passed on to consumers and then eventually decomposers, and then it can get re-released into the abiotic phase and eventually reincorporated into producers entering the biotic phase back again. So this is sort of the general big picture look at these cycles. Now we're going to focus on the biotic phase of nutrient cycles. Nutrients are moved from one organism to the next by feeding relationships, right? They go from producers to consumer, and so on and so forth. You've got some examples down here on the bottom, from the parrotfish munching on algae on the rocks to a sea lion munching on a fish and a sea star munching on a fish. Something a little interesting. But either way, these nutrients that they ingest can be lost through egestion and excretion, so essentially waste products, getting rid of things that are undigested and whatnot. Now, what are they getting rid of? What are they dealing with? Nutrients are found as organic compounds, such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So yes, this is where we want to refrain and recall some of that information you learned in biology about organic chemistry. Now, when we look at organic molecules, we start off with a single unit called a monomer, the smallest unit of a polymer, which is, of course, the larger molecule made up of many repeating subunits. And you can see all this on the right. The monomers are the single green little eggs, and the polymer is the chain of green eggs, right? So what are these green eggs? They're actually not eggs. They're going to be molecules. And that's going to be different depending on whether it's a lipid, a protein, a carbohydrate, whatever we're talking about. But all of them start off as single units called monomers and then join up to become chains of polymers. Now, the first organic molecule we'll look at are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're actually the most abundant biological molecule on Earth, and you know them a lot from the foods because we talk about this when you're growing up, right? Everything from oatmeal, beans, lentils, cereal, things like that are all considered carbohydrates when we eat them. But remember, they actually include a bunch of other things too, because most plants are making carbohydrates. That's what photosynthesis does. So you see seagrass and phytoplankton down there imaged. Now, they're used for energy and also for structural components as well. The most common monomer for carbohydrates is glucose. And here is the glucose molecule labeled for you, just so you can see what it looks like. Now, this glucose is, again, a product of photosynthesis. So this is how these carbon and oxygen, all this stuff, get incorporated into organic matter. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, the monomer here is glucose. And if you start adding them together, you get starch and cellulose. Starch is a carbohydrate made from chains of glucose molecules joined together. And you can see two examples of them on the top right. Now, these are energy storage molecules in plants and algae cells. They are insoluble, so it doesn't affect the water potential of the cell itself. Now, cellulose is an important component to the plant cell walls, which is made from many straight chains of glucose molecules held together by hydrogen bonds. And if you look on the bottom right, you'll see that chain of glucose, two of them held together by the hydrogen bonds. Now, these are essentially microfibrils that join together to form cellulose fibers. It makes cellulose really strong, and plants can remain upright without a skeletal system, at least in the terrestrial world, but it also works when you look at things like seagrasses and whatnot as well. Now let's switch over to lipids. Now, lipids are made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Some also have phosphorus and nitrogen in them as well. Now, a monomer for a lipid would be glycerol and fatty acids, either or. Now, fatty acids are lipid molecules that are a major constituent of triglycerides and phospholipids. We'll get into that in a minute. And if you look on the right, you'll see glycerol up there and fatty acids at the top of the image. Now, a polymer is an example of triglycerides. Now, triglycerides is a type of lipid which is made from glycerol molecules joined to 3 fatty acid chains. It's used for storage of energy and insulation and protection, especially in the marine environment where thermoregulation is a big issue. Now, the term hydrophobic is a molecule without a charge which repels water molecules. Long fatty acid chains are hydrophobic. Phospholipids are the main components of membranes and steroids. So when we talk about cell membranes and things like that, if you look at the middle picture down there, you'll see water droplet in a hydrophilic surface, which is something that's water-liking, and it's spread out a little bit more. The contact angle is very wide. If you look at the bottom there, you see the hydrophobic surface where the water is a bubble, just like the leaf on the top right. The contact angle is much smaller. Essentially, it's being repelled by the hydrophobic surface. And then on the left, you'll see the phospholipid bilayer, the actual membrane that we're talking about, with the hydrophobic heads sticking up and the fatty acid chains in the middle, right, and either side of the membrane. This helps essentially keep barriers around cells and maintains structural integrity. Next up, we've got proteins. Now, proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, and their monomers are amino acids. There are about 20 different amino acids that form proteins. The order of the amino acids are determined by DNA, which is why we talk a lot about DNA in biology in general. And so on the right, you see the individual amino acids, and they are held together in a polypeptide chain with a peptide bond between them. Proteins form a lot of critical things for us. For example, enzymes, which help speed up chemical reactions, which really helps a lot of things and processes within our bodies. I gave you an image over on the right that gives you an idea of how they work. Essentially, you have a substrate and you have the enzyme takes that in, and then it sort of does its thing and speeds up the reaction. But you don't have to know too much about that. Just to understand that's what they do. Hormones are also really important as well because they're chemical messengers that essentially tell your body what to do and when to do it. You talk a lot about hormones when you're growing up because there's a lot of hormones that get released as you are developing, which helps you go from a baby to a young adult to an adult. But there's a lot of hormones that work throughout your entire life as well to modulate and regulate things in your body. Also, parts of bones, muscle, and skin, and cartilage and blood, they're all protein-based. So you get the fish with its muscles and the skeletal systems and the cartilage and the shark, things like that. They also are parts of cell walls in plants. Now we're going to switch over to the abiotic phase of nutrient cycles. So after animals die, after their death, organisms are going to be broken down by decomposers, and that's going to release nutrients in their inorganic forms. Now, nutrients can be found in several forms as ions dissolved in water, like magnesium and carbonate and phosphate and nitrate and things like that, as gases in the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, and they can also form sediments that can later become rocks. And there's a diagram in the right there that kind of shows you some of this, where CO2 is coming and going from the atmosphere into the ocean, or organic carbon is being deposited on the ocean floor, that kind of a thing. There's a picture of a whale fall, which is a dead whale carcass kind of decomposing on the bottom on the left. Now, there are reservoirs of nutrients out there. Now, a reservoir is a part of the abiotic nutrient cycle where soluble nutrients can remain for long periods of time. Now, the ocean is a really important reservoir for many different nutrients. And what this means is it holds on to particular nutrients for long periods of time. For example, carbon is a perfect example. It can get caught up in sediments and stay in the ocean for thousands of years, and way longer than that. Now, how long that nutrient stays in the system is called residence time. It's the average time that a particle spends in a particular system, and this can vary depending on what's going on. In an ocean, for example, many nutrient ions fall to the bottom as feces or dead organisms, leading to very long residence times. Now, in the surface layers of the ocean, the residency time can be much shorter because of constant use and recycling by organisms. And this is due to the fact that there's a high level of productivity with phytoplankton and a high turnover rate. Now, the table on the bottom here gives you an idea of what the residency times can look like for different nutrients. Phosphate, for example, 20 to 100,000 years. Magnesium, 17 million years. Carbon, 100,000 years. Nitrogen, look, it's a little quicker, 2,000 years. That kind of thing. Calcium, 1 million years. These are long residency times, really. And this brings us to the idea of nutrient availability and productivity. Nutrient availability is often the main limiting factor for producers in the ocean. Nitrogen and phosphorus are found in very low concentrations and limit the growth of productivity. If you look at all of these different ions in the ocean, look where nitrate and phosphate fall. They are incredibly small, 0.5 to 0.07 parts per million compared to chloride and calcium and all these other ions. So great, we have all of these nutrients out there. They're really important to organic molecules. We know they have biotic and abiotic components to their cycles. How do they get replenished? So that's the series of things we're going to go over now. We're going to start with dissolving of atmospheric gases. Mostly we're talking about carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Now, the amount of gas that can be dissolved in water depends on, which we've learned before, temperature of the water. Lower temps equals more dissolved gases. Atmospheric concentration of the gas, how much is it in the atmosphere, and the amount of mixing in the surface water, how much like wave action, things like that are going on. Next up, we have the overall concentration, which tends to remain at equilibrium but can vary. Sinks are areas where more gases are dissolving into the water than diffusing into the atmosphere, essentially a net loss of material. And then we have sources are areas where more gases are diffusing into the atmosphere than dissolving into the water, a net gain of material. Continuing on with replenishment of dissolved nutrients, we have recycling through biological processes. First up, we have excretion, which is the removal of waste produced by chemical reactions within living things. You do this every day, right? We've got carbon dioxide produced through respiration. That's what you're breathing out and outgassing CO2 all the time. Then we have nitrogenous waste, which is excreted in the form of urine for mammals and ammonia for fish. Then we have decomposition, where dead organic matter are broken down by decomposers, fungi and bacteria, of course. Then proteins are broken down into amino acids and then into ammonia and nitrates, so it's released. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and used for respiration, releasing the carbon dioxide. And you can see a bit of a food chain going on here on the bottom that gives you the example of how this stuff moves around. Upwelling is another critical component for replenishment. It's that movement of cold water from the deep in the ocean towards the surface, and we've learned about the mechanics of this already. And really the key thing is this deep water has a higher concentration of nutrients than surface waters. We know that because remember, fecal matter, dead organisms, all that stuff sinks to the bottom of the ocean and it gets trapped in that density barrier and it can't get back up without some sort of a force or upwelling doing that. And so that's really the key thing. Now, how does that occur? Just a reminder, you got winds, of course, that blow across the surface of the ocean, causing the deep water to rise up and replace it. There's a nice little temperature graph there on the bottom left that shows you that process off the coast of California, for example. If you're in coastal communities, runoff from land is a really big component, right? It's part of that water cycle. As water is being pushed off land into the ocean, it brings with it everything it dissolved. This includes soluble nutrients that are leached from the soil and deposited into the ocean. Now, this can happen naturally, but it can also be amplified by humans. Now, if we go back to geology, we've got some tectonic processes that can play a role here. Hydrothermal vents, for example, nutrients that are dissolved in that water are released at the vents, and that's used as fuel for vent communities. Some of that dissolved nutrients makes it into the surface waters through upwelling. Then we have tectonic processes that add rock, volcanic eruptions, and things like that, mountain formation. Here's a picture of Tonga, or off the South Pacific in the islands of Tonga, a volcano that's essentially erupting from the surface of the ocean. So weathering and erosion of these components can also add to those soluble nutrients that run into the water. Now that we've talked about replenishment, now let's talk about depletion and removal of dissolved nutrients. First up, we have uptake by primary producers, which is a great place to start. Remember, phytoplankton, everything that goes through photosynthesis, these are the things that are essentially synthesizing organic substances, and that transfers nutrients across all the other trophic levels. Now we know in the marine environment, phytoplankton are a huge part of that process. Now, a majority of things sink to the sea floor, and we have this thing called marine snow. which are particles of organic material that fall from the surface layers to the deeper ocean. This includes things like feces and detritus, which is decaying organic matter, and dead organisms, especially phytoplankton and zooplankton, which do tend to have calcium carbonate parts of their exoskeletons and things like that. And all this stuff falls and it looks like snow going all the way to the bottom. Now, they are consumed by multiple trophic levels and provide food for the deep water organisms, because remember, there's no sun down there, there's no photosynthesis, so with the exception of hydrothermal vents, which are just a small little area here and there, most of the seafloor relies on this detritus essentially coming from the surface waters to fuel it. And it's a slow decomposing process on the seabed due to the cold and lack of oxygen. So and that's one of the reasons why the ocean floor looks so pasty white. It can also be affected through removal by harvesting, which is human consumption, removing and eating fish and other marine organisms. And it can sometimes be re-released back as sewage, so there's that. You can also have incorporation into coral reefs, and this is deposition of calcium carbonate as the coral grows. Now I want to go back over density, layers, and nutrient availability. The majority of nutrients are found at depth below the pycnocline, below that density difference, right? Now surface waters are limited in nutrients unless there's some sort of a mixing of these layers, and that is different depending on whether you're in the tropics, the temperate, or the polar regions. In the tropics, there's essentially a big difference in temperature between surface water and deep water all year long, and there's not much mixing, which is why in the tropics you tend to have low nutrient availability. Now, in temperate zones, the mixing occurs in the winter, and if you look at the middle graph there for temperature, you'll notice how there's a big difference in the temperature from summer to winter. When it becomes winter, you get some mixing, and then as summer progresses, that nutrient flow is cut off, but then the productivity can happen with whatever nutrients remains at the surface after that mixing happened. In polar regions, you have mixing occurring all year. There's not a whole lot of difference in temperature. However, there is a difference in how much light is available, so that becomes a big factor as well. On the right, you'll see a graph that shows nutrient availability and nitrogen, essentially. And in the surface waters, you'll notice both Atlantic and Pacific, it's a much low concentration in the surface waters, and as you go deeper, the concentration increases. So we know that latitude plays a big role, just like we talked about. So in tropical regions, even though we have a lot of light, the water is very warm at the surface, and so there's strong thermoclines that prevents that mixing. And you can see that in the diagram on the bottom right. You'll see algae and herbivores, which are indicators, right? They're pretty equitable all through the year with little ups and downs, but not too drastic. Then you get to polar regions. The waters are very nutrient rich with very weak thermoclines and access to nutrients in surface waters, and you have long food chains, 5 to even 6 trophic levels. Productivity, however, is only high in the summer when the light levels are high. So if you look at that top graph where you see herbivores and algae, there's this first spike of algae, of course, and then the herbivores follow. But it's all right there in May, June, July, August, September. So it's in those summer warmer months when you actually have light. Now, the last thing we'll talk about will be eutrophication or algae blooms, which is the process by which a body of water becomes enriched in dissolved nutrients, such as nitrates and phosphates, that stimulate the growth of producers, usually resulting in the depletion of dissolved oxygen. Essentially, we got excessive levels of nutrients that can cause a rapid and increased algal population known as an algae bloom. Now on the right, you can see a process here. You've got plenty of sunlight, you've got excess nutrients that causes that algae bloom, and then the decay of the algae as it dies starts to suck up the oxygen. Now when we have an algal bloom, the densities can be up to 5 million cells per liter, and it can damage the ecosystem. It can do a bunch of things. First of all, it can clog the gills of fish, which is not good, right? As algae cells die, bacteria populations increase, essentially because they're decomposers and they're going to do what decomposers do, but they use up oxygen through respiration in that process. The cycle can lead to a hypoxic condition or low oxygen, and if algal species involved produce toxins, then you get red tides and mass mortality events that can result. So human health can be a factor in this as well. I know that was a lot of information, so thanks for hanging in there. And of course, let's reframe those main ideas here. Nutrients are materials that are required by organisms for an energy supply and for growth and maintenance of body tissues. The availability of nutrients has a large effect on productivity and therefore the types of numbers of organisms that live in different parts of the ocean at different times. And of course, until next time, keep learning.